So now we know what it means for two triangles to be congruent and the notation we use to say that triangles are congruent. So let's look a little more closely into when triangles are congruent. Do you have to have all 6 pairs of matching angles and sides, 3 pairs of sides, 3 pairs of angles, to know that the two triangles are congruent? Well, how about these two triangles? Are they congruent? Now notice, all 3 of the sides are marked. So we do have, let me draw an arrow, we do have matching sides. So for example, this side here is congruent to this side here is congruent to that one, and this side here is congruent to that one. We also have 2 pairs of angles. This angle up here is congruent to that one, they have the same marks, and this angle here is congruent to that one. Notice that we're not showing these missing angles here. Do we know they're congruent or not? Well, we do know that all the angles in a triangle add up to 180 degrees. So if I subtract off the 2 that we have, if I subtract off this one and this one, I'm going to be left with the same amount as if I subtract off these 2, whatever they are. So I know that if I have 2 pairs of the angles congruent, therefore this third, let's do a marking like that, I guess, or we can do 3 like that, 1, 2, 3. I know that those angles have to be congruent as well. And so now I've got all 6 pieces congruent. It's also important to know the order that they're marked. So for example, this angle here with the single mark is in between the 2 sides that have 2 marks and 3 marks. Over here, the angle with the single mark is in between the 2 sides with 2 marks and 3 marks. Also, it's across from the side with 1 mark. All right, so you want to check that and make sure that they wind up being, the markings are in the same order, even if one of the triangles is turned or flipped. So these 2 triangles are congruent for sure. So actually, if I have all 3 pairs of sides congruent and 2 of the pairs of angles, I know the triangles will still be congruent. Well, maybe I don't even need to know that much. What about these 2? Now I've only got 4 pairs of things congruent. Is that enough to tell me that these 2 triangles have to be the same shape and size? Well, like we've mentioned already, since 2 of the angles are marked, I know automatically the third angle is also going to be congruent. So I know that this angle here is going to be congruent to this angle here. Alright, now what about the sides though? I have this side, which is in between the angle with 2 marks and 3 marks, is congruent to this side, which is between the angles with 2 marks and 3 marks. So that seems good. And then the other side I have is over here, which happens to be across from that angle. Same thing over here, across from the same angle. It turns out that it is guaranteed that these 2 triangles are going to be congruent, even though we only knew 4 pairs of things matched up. So that works. Well, maybe we can even do less than that. What if we only had 3 pairs of things congruent? Is that enough to guarantee that these triangles have to be the same shape and size? Well, first of all, the order is really important. So notice I've got 2 angles here, matching these 2 angles here. Therefore, we know the third angle has to match as well. And I've got this side here, which is next to the double marked side, and the angle that's not marked matches with this side here, which is also between the angle with the double marks and the angle that's not marked. So everything is marked in the same order. It turns out that this is enough information to prove these triangles congruent. So having 3 pairs of congruent parts seems to be enough to say the 2 triangles are congruent. But it turns out not always. So 4 for sure, 5 certainly, and 6 of course, because everything matches up. But so we're going to go all the way down to if we have markings with 3 pairs of congruent parts in a certain order, that'll be enough to guarantee that the 2 triangles are congruent. So let's look at this picture. Here I have three pairs. I've got one angle, a second angle, and a third angle. So I have three pairs of corresponding angles are congruent. Does that guarantee these two triangles are congruent? What do you think? Well, it turns out no. They're going to be the same shape, but they might not necessarily be the same size. If I took this first triangle on a piece of paper and I went to a copier and hit 200% and copy, I'd make a triangle that's the same shape as this because the angles all match, but it's not the same size, obviously. This one's twice as big as that one. So these two triangles are not congruent. So just by having all the angles match isn't enough to say the two triangles are congruent. So that's not going to work. And let me abbreviate that. So 1, 2, 3 pairs of angles is not enough to prove the triangles are congruent. All right, so what specific arrangement or order of 3 parts do we need to guarantee the triangles are congruent? Well, here they are. You can prove 2 triangles are congruent with 3 pairs of matching parts, but only if they're in this certain order. All 3 sides, that would prove the triangles have to be the same size and shape. If you have 2 sides and the angle between those 2 sides, or if you have 2 angles and the side between those angles. I'll talk a little bit about the angle side when we get to the angle side angle. Let's start with the side side. If I showed you this, according to this theorem, we know that these 2 triangles are exactly the same shape and size because I have one pair of sides match, a second pair of sides match, and a third pair of sides match. There's no way you could make a triangle with sides 11, 12, and 15 that would not be the same shape and size as this one. No matter how hard you try, even if you spin it around or flip it over, always going to be the same. So in terms of marking this, I would say that is congruent to that, that one's congruent to that, and that one's congruent to that. So these 2 triangles are congruent by side, side, side. And that's how we abbreviate it, SSS. All right, let's look at side angle side. If we have 2 triangles like this. Now notice, I have 2 pairs of sides, 11 and 15, and then the angle is in between the 2 sides. So the angle that they're showing me here is in between the 15 and the 11 side. It's where they meet. If the 47 was over here, that wouldn't work. It has to be in between, and hence that's why this order is important. Side, then an angle, then a side. So side, angle, and then a side. And so if I'm marking the picture, I would mark this side is congruent to that side, this angle is congruent to this angle, and that side's congruent to that side. So we would say these 2 triangles are congruent by side angle side. All right, let's look at the last case. Oh, I'm sorry, let's back up for a second. Notice, let me give you an example of one that does not work. These 2 are not necessarily congruent. I have a side here, 11 matches with that side. This side 15 matches with this side. Angle 47 is congruent to 47. But notice where the angle's at. It's not in between the 2 sides. So I don't have these 2 angles here. Let me mark the figure. Got this angle congruent to this angle. Got this side congruent to this side congruent to that side. So in this case, and it doesn't matter which way you look at it. So if I look at what I marked first, I have this angle, then this side, and then this side. So I work my way around the triangle with my markings. I have an angle here, then a side, then a side. So that's angle, side, side. And obviously we don't want to be saying that, so that doesn't work. And even if you read it backwards, if you said, okay, I've got a side, and then I've got another side, and then I have an angle. That's really just saying the same thing, but backwards. So if your markings show you that in that order, the triangles are not necessarily congruent. All right, let's look at the third case. Angle, side, angle. Once again, the order is important. Grab my arrow. The angle here is important, so we have two angles, matching two angles, and we have a side congruent to a side. But notice the side here is in between the two angles. It's not a side over here or here. It's the one that's in between the two angles, and it's the same over here. It's in between the two angles. So for this to work, you have to have your side between your two angles. Otherwise, I'll show you what happens when it doesn't. So we have an angle here, congruent to an angle over here, and then the 53s are equal, and then we have this side here. So following those markings, and you can read this either counterclockwise or clockwise. I've got an angle, then a side, and then an angle. Or if we read it the other way, I have an angle, then this side, then this angle. We would say that these two triangles are congruent by angle, side, angle. Now, what would happen if the side they gave us was over here, let's say, across from the 53? Now we don't have angle, side, angle. What we have, you could read it as a side, and then an angle, and then an angle. Or you could read it as an angle, and then a side. So, either way you want to read that, we have an angle, and then a side. Or if we did it the other way, side, angle, angle. That means they both mean the same thing. It's the same picture here. It turns out that this also works. And we usually write it as angle, angle, side, but it wouldn't be wrong if you said side, angle, angle. And the reason it works is because we know in a triangle all the angles add up to 180. So like I mentioned earlier, once you have two angles, you know the third one is congruent. So therefore, I know this angle here is going to have to match this angle here. And then I've got the 71 congruent to itself. And the 8 is in between those two. So this is really just another case of angle, side, angle. Angle, then a side, then an angle. So that's why that was written in parentheses in that theorem. So you can either have ASA, or I'll write it underneath, or you could have angle, angle, side. So those are the 3/4 ways to prove triangles congruent. Either side, 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 all three sides match. Side, angle, side, where the angle is between two sides. Or angle, side, angle, where the side is between two angles. Notice you have to have at least one side. There's no angle, angle, angle. Because as I showed you, one could just be a lot larger than the other. All right, so let's look at some examples. So which one of these postulates, side, 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 angle, side, or angle, side, angle, guarantees that the triangles are going to be congruent? How about this picture here? All right, so what do we have? We have a side of 19, matches a side of 19. So let's mark that. That side's congruent to that side. We have a 25-degree angle, congruent to a 25-degree angle. And we have a side of 23 centimeters, congruent to a side of 23. So what do we have? We have a side, and then an angle, and then another side. Or if you read it backwards, this side, then this angle, then that side. It's the same frontwards and backwards. So this would be yes by side, angle, side. And so that's all you have to do is determine is it yes or no, and if it's yes, by which one of these? Side, 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 angle, side, or angle, side, angle. All right, how about these two? Well, we have a pair of sides that are 5, that's one pair of sides. We have another pair of sides that are 7, so we have two pairs of sides. So those are congruent, and those are congruent. But that's it. Well, that's only two pairs of things. Well, what do we know though? If we look at this picture, these two triangles share a side. in the top triangle, that third side is the same as the third side in the bottom triangle. So that side here is congruent to itself by what we call the reflexive property. You might want to make sure you jot that down because that's going to come up a lot. By the reflexive property, this side is congruent to itself. And so therefore, what do we have? We have a side, another side, and a third side. So side, side, side. So these two triangles are congruent by side, side, side. Let's look at another example. The bow tie example, I call this. Well, what do we have? We have one pair of angles and we have one pair of sides. And you're thinking, well, that's only two. We need three things. So what do we have? We've got this angle here congruent to this one. We have this side congruent to this side. Now, is there anything else we've learned in the past that could help us here? Well, hopefully you noticed with this X in the picture that creates vertical angles, and we learned that vertical angles are congruent. So I know this angle is going to be congruent to this one. I don't know how many degrees it is, but I know they're both going to be the same. So let me write that in parentheses. I marked that third piece by saying vertical angles are congruent. So that's what allowed me to mark that. So now what do I have? In this triangle I have an angle, and then a side, and then an angle. In the other triangle I have an angle, and then a side, and then an angle. So they match up. So these two triangles are congruent by angle, side, angle. All right, let's try one more, or maybe two more. All right, how about these? Well, we've got a pair of matching sides, 12 and 12. Another pair of matching sides, 15 and 15. We have an angle, 54 degrees, 54 degrees. So we've got two sides and an angle. But unfortunately, we know that it's supposed to be side, angle, side. And here we don't have a side and an angle and then a side. We would need this 54 to be over here, between the two sides. Have to be here in order to have side, angle, side. So what we actually have here is a side and then an angle. Or if you did it backwards, an angle and then a side and then a side. And we know that there's no angle, side, side. So these two triangles are not necessarily congruent. We would need more information to say yes or no for sure. All right, how about this last pair? What do we have here? Looks like we've got a pair of sides that match. We've got two angles that match. So you might think, yeah, I think that would work. We have two angles and a side. Isn't this angle, side, angle? Well, we have to be careful about where things are. Notice this side here is not between these two angles. In this triangle, that side is between the two angles. So this marking would need to be over here for these two to match and be angle, side, angle. So this one is also no. All right, let's go through one more time. Now this might be a good one where you go through yourself and come up with what you think the answers are and then check them. All right, so I'm looking at this first picture and what I have, let's draw an arrow. I have two angles, and I have a side that's not between them. But I do know the third angles are going to be congruent because they all add up to 180. So you could either say, if you mark these third angles, you could say angle, side, angle, or without even doing that, you could say yes by angle, angle, side. Okay, the next one, the green triangles. What do we have here? We have a pair of sides, another pair of sides, and a pair of angles. The angle, though, is not between the two sides. If it was, then we would have side, angle, side. But right now we have angle, side, side. So this one's a no. How about the purple ones? we have two pairs of angles that match and one pair of sides. So we've got two angles and a side. And so that one is also yes. By angle, angle, side. Unless you were paying attention and I tricked you, and this one actually is no. Oops. Why not? Well, if you look more closely, look at this side that's marked here. This side that's marked is next to the double marked angle and the angle that's not marked at all. This side here is next to the single marked angle and the angle that's not marked. Or another way of thinking about it is look at the angle across from it. That's a single marked angle, but here it's the double marked angle. So they're not in the correct order. I would have need to put this side over here, and then I would say yes by angle, angle, side. All right, how about these triangles here? Well, this one's yes, because they share a side, so I can mark that in the picture. And so now I know these triangles are congruent by side, side, side. And the last one, these two blue triangles. Well, right now I've only got two pairs of sides, but hopefully you notice that you have vertical angles, so we can mark the vertical angles are congruent. And so now it is yes by side, angle, side. And notice the angle is between the two sides in both pictures. All right, so hopefully you have a better handle on how to determine if two triangles are congruent.